When the castle glows with candlelight, the shadows seem harmless. Yet it is often in the brightest halls that the oldest darkness waits unseen. Good evening, my friends. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you into a tale hidden beneath the foundations of the wizarding world itself. Beyond enchanted corridors and forgotten records, there are secrets older than memory, patient and silent in the dark. So settle in, and let us follow the whispers where few witches or wizards have ever dared to listen. The rain fell softly over London, tapping against the tall windows of the Ministry of Magic, as though it carried a warning no one had yet understood. Deep below the bustling streets, past the lifts that shimmered with golden light and the endless corridors lined with polished wood, something stirred. Not loudly, not violently, but deliberately. Auror Elara Vance did not yet know this. She stood in the atrium, cloak damp from the rain, watching as witches and wizards hurried past her in anxious clusters. There was something wrong with the ministry, something that could not be explained by paperwork delays or political disagreements. Even the enchanted fountain at the center, usually gleaming with pride, seemed dimmer, its figures less lively than they ought to be. Elara adjusted her grip on her wand. For 3 weeks now, reports had been arriving. Small at first, easy to dismiss. A misfiled record, a forgotten charm. A senior official speaking nonsense during an important meeting. But then the incidents grew stranger. A Wizengamot member had claimed to hear voices whispering beneath the courtroom floor. An entire office in magical law enforcement had worked through the night, convinced they were under attack, only for no threat to ever appear. And yesterday, an experienced Auror had cast a shield charm at nothing, and screamed as if something unseen had struck him. Elara had been assigned to investigate. She did not like mysteries that left no trace. Vance. She turned at the sharp voice. Standing near the golden gates was Corbin Hale, a senior Auror with a face carved from years of suspicion. His dark robes were immaculate, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said. "I'm on time," Elara replied calmly. "You're early." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he said nothing of it. Instead, he handed her a thin file. "Another case," he said. "Level 7, Department of Magical Games and Sports." Elara raised an eyebrow. "Games and sports?" "Exactly," Corbin said. "Makes no sense, which means it's yours." She opened the file as they began walking toward the lifts. The report was brief. A broom testing official collapsed during inspection, claimed something old was watching him. No evidence of curse or hex. Memory intact. Elara frowned slightly. "Old," she repeated. "That's the 3rd time that word's been used." Corbin gave a short nod. "And the 3rd department affected." The lift doors slid open, and they stepped inside. As it descended, the golden grate rattled softly, the familiar voice announcing each level. But something felt different today. The air seemed heavier, as though the deeper they went, the more the ministry itself pressed in around them. "Tell me," Elara said quietly, "what do you think this is?" Corbin didn't answer immediately. "I think," he said at last, "we're missing something obvious." Elara glanced at him. "That's not like you." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The lift slowed. "Level 7, the voice announced. The doors opened. The Department of Magical Games and Sports was usually one of the more lively places in the ministry. Bright posters of Quidditch teams lined the walls, and enchanted models of broomsticks zipped through the air. today it was silent. Too silent. A few witches sat at their desks, working stiffly, their eyes fixed on their parchments. None of them spoke. None of them looked up. Elara stepped forward. "Something's wrong," she murmured. Corbin nodded. "Stay sharp." They approached the office mentioned in the report. The door was slightly ajar. Elara pushed it open. Inside, the room was in disarray. Papers scattered across the floor, a chair overturned, and in the center of it all stood a young wizard, pale and trembling. He turned as they entered. "You," he stammered. "Your aurors?" Elara stepped closer. "We are. You're safe." His eyes darted to the corners of the room. "No," he whispered. "No, I'm not." Corbin closed the door behind them. "Tell us what happened," he said. The wizard swallowed hard. "I was testing the new broom designs," he began. "Everything was fine, normal. Then, I heard something." "What kind of something?" Elara asked. "A voice," he said, "but not like a person. It was deeper, older." Elara exchanged a glance with Corbin. "What did it say?" she pressed. The wizard hesitated. "It didn't use words," he said at last. "Not really. It was more like a feeling." "A feeling of what?" He looked at her, his face pale as parchment. "Of being watched," he said, "like something had been waiting. For a very long time." A chill ran through the room. Corbin stepped forward. "Did you see anything?" The wizard shook his head quickly. "No, but I felt it, right here." He pressed a hand to his chest. "Like it was inside me." Elara's grip tightened on her wand. "Did it try to control you?" she asked. The wizard's breathing quickened. "I don't know," he said. I lost time, only a few seconds. But when I came back..." He gestured to the room. "I'd done this. I don't remember doing it." Silence settled between them. Elara took a slow breath. "All right," she said gently. "We're going to take you to St. Mungo's. They'll run some tests. You're going to be fine." The wizard nodded, though he didn't look convinced. As Corbin escorted him out, Elara remained behind for a moment. She stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning every detail. Nothing obvious. No curse residue, no magical trace she could detect. And yet, she felt it. Faint, almost imperceptible. A presence. Her heart quickened. "Elara." Corbin's voice snapped her out of it. She turned and followed him out, closing the door behind her. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. Not the wizard. Not Corbin. Something else. Something hidden. Something ancient. Far below them, deeper than any office or courtroom, beneath even the Department of Mysteries. Something stirred again. And this time, it was awake. By the time Elara Vance returned to Level 2, the uneasy silence that had settled over the ministry seemed to have spread like frost across a window pane, touching everything without quite revealing its shape. And although the clerks still moved between offices with armfuls of files, and the interdepartmental memos still flew in purple swarms through the air, there was a curious stiffness in the building that made every sound feel muffled, as though the ministry itself were listening to footsteps that no living witch or wizard had made. Corbin Hale walked beside her without speaking, which in itself did not trouble Elara, for he had always been a man who guarded his thoughts with the same stern efficiency with which he guarded evidence. Yet she could tell from the set of his jaw and the restless movement of his wand hand that the case had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They entered the Auror office, where rain-dark cloaks hung from brass pegs and enchanted maps glimmered faintly across the far wall, and at once they were met by a squat, silver-haired witch with sharp black eyes, who stood waiting beside Alara's desk with the look of someone who had already grown impatient 3 times over. "Madam Stroud," said Alara, recognizing the head of internal security, whose visits rarely brought good news and never brought pleasant ones. "Vance," said Madam Stroud, wasting no time on politeness, "you are to come with me at once, and Hale as well, because the minister has called for a restricted briefing, which means either we have a problem no one understands or a problem no one wishes to name, and at present I would not care to guess which is worse." Corbin arched an eyebrow. "The minister himself?" "The acting minister," said Stroud curtly. "Do try to keep pace." Without waiting to see whether they followed, she swept out of the office, and Alara and Corbin exchanged one brief look before going after her. They were led not upward, as Alara had expected, but downward, past the level of the Auror headquarters and still farther below, until the lift paused with a low shudder and the golden gate slid open onto a corridor Alara had only seen twice before, both times under orders sealed with ministry wax and signed in a hand so old-fashioned it looked like something copied from the 18th century. The corridor was narrow, windowless, and lined with doors that had no nameplates, only numbers burned into black metal, while the torches fixed along the walls cast a steady blue flame that gave no warmth at all. "The Department of Mysteries?" Alara said quietly. "An outer section," Madam Stroud replied. "The unspeakables are being less unhelpful than usual, which is how I know matters are serious." At the corridor's end stood a circular chamber in pale stone, smaller than the great black hall most visitors imagined when they thought of the department below. And in that chamber waited 6 people, among them acting Minister Julian Crew, who looked as though sleep had been a stranger to him for at least a week, and a tall wizard in dark blue robes whose face Alara did not know, though the silver sigil on his collar marked him as an unspeakable of unusual rank. Crew began speaking the moment they entered, as if he feared delay might allow the danger to grow teeth. "A half hour ago," he said, "an entire records annex on level 1 sealed itself from the inside." And every witch and wizard in the room began repeating the same phrase in voices not their own, after which they collapsed and remembered nothing. Alara felt a cold tightening in her chest. What phrase? The minister glanced toward the unspeakable, who answered in a low, clear voice. "They remember the first law." The words seemed to fall into the room like stones into dark water. Corbin folded his arms. "That means nothing." "No," said the unspeakable, "which is precisely why it means something." Madam Stroud gave him a dry look. "Try saying that again in a way useful to non-unspeakables." A shadow of impatience crossed his face, though his voice remained measured. "My name is Septimus Vale," he said. "For several months we have been tracking an anomaly beneath the ministry, one that appears connected to a cluster of artifacts older than any recorded ministry archive, and possibly older than the institution itself. We believed the disturbance dormant. We were wrong." Alara took a step nearer. "What kind of artifacts?" Vale hesitated, which told her at once that whatever answer followed would be unpleasant. "Objects buried in Foundation vaults that were never meant to be disturbed," he said. "Not Horcruxes, not cursed objects in the ordinary sense, and not relics of the Founders, though they may belong to the same broad age of British magical history. Their makers are unknown. Their purpose is not." "And what purpose is that?" asked Corbin. "To bind will," said Vale. No one spoke for a moment. The minister broke the silence. "We have not gone public because panic in the ministry would spread into the wizarding world before nightfall, and I will not have Diagon Alley emptied and Hogwarts owls flooded with frightened letters because we failed to contain a threat inside our own walls." "Hogwarts?" Elara said sharply. "Does this affect the school?" "Not yet," said Vale. "There is no indication that the influence extends beyond the ministry. The source appears anchored here." That ought to have been reassuring, yet it was not, for an evil that was anchored could also be fed, and one that fed could grow. Elara looked from the minister to Vale. "Say it plainly. What are we dealing with?" Vale held her gaze, and for the first time, some of the reserve in his expression cracked, revealing not fear exactly, but the worn strain of a man who had come too close to knowledge he wished he did not possess. "There are references," he said, "in pre-ministry magical fragments, most of them incomplete and several dismissed as legend, to beings or powers once called the First Ones, which is almost certainly not their true name, but merely the name later generations gave them when the older words were lost. They are described not as gods and not as ghosts, but as intelligences tied to early magic in Britain, things that could not shape the world directly and therefore ruled through human minds." Corbin made an impatient sound. "Legend." "Yes," said Vale, which ceases to be a comforting word when legends begin behaving like evidence. Madame Stroud motioned to the table in the center of the room, where several objects lay beneath a shimmer of protective enchantments, and Elara saw at once that none of them belonged together in any ordinary sense. A chipped stone disc carved with spirals so faded they seemed to vanish when looked at directly, a length of blackened chain, a tarnished goblet of no identifiable school, and a thin shard of something pale and glass-like that gave off a faint silver light. "These," said Vale, "were recovered from sealed chambers beneath the ministry over the course of the last 80 years, and every chamber was discovered by accident during repairs, expansions, or curse damage. Each time the objects were removed, the disturbances stopped." Elara stared at the shard. "Until now." "Until now," Vale agreed. The minister passed a hand over his face. 3 nights ago, one of the vault wards failed for 12 seconds. That was enough. Since then, reports have escalated daily." Elara felt the shape of the conflict at last, stark and hard as iron. There was no political intrigue at the center of this, no mere hidden curse spreading through dusty archives, but an old intelligence pushing against the edges of the world through the relics that remained of its power. And unless someone found the broken point where that power touched the ministry, more people would fall under its influence, perhaps enough in time to paralyze the ministry altogether. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Vale answered at once. "An Auror team small enough to move quietly, skilled enough to defend themselves if the influence turns violent, and stubborn enough not to walk away when the Department of Mysteries tells them they are in danger." Corbin gave the faintest hint of a grim smile. "That narrows the field." "You will go with Vale," said the minister, looking at Elara and Corbin both. "You will trace the source of the breaches, identify whether these objects are being activated or merely responding, and you will report only to me and Madame Stroud until this is contained." Elara frowned. "Why us?" There was the briefest pause, and it was Madame Stroud who answered. "Because," she said, "all the officials most senior to you have either already been exposed, are under observation, or cannot be trusted until this is over." That landed harder than any dramatic proclamation could have done, for it was practical and plain, and therefore almost certainly true. Vale moved a hand over the table, and the protective shimmer withdrew just enough for him to take up the pale shard with gloved fingers. "This was found nearest the original foundation stone of the ministry," he said. "The recent disturbances appear strongest wherever it is moved." Corbin narrowed his eyes. "Then why move it at all?" "Because," said Vale, "it moved first." Even Madame Stroud looked startled at that, and Alara felt the room turn colder, though none of the blue flames along the wall had changed. Vale set the shard down again with extraordinary care. "At midnight yesterday it was discovered 3 feet from the containment ring in which it had rested for 70 years, and no witch or wizard entered the chamber between inspections. We have doubled the wards. It no longer matters. Something is waking below us, and these relics are not the cause but the doors." The words had barely left him when a bell began ringing somewhere deep in the corridor beyond. Not loud, but urgent, its iron note echoing through the stone passages like the cry of a bird trapped underground. Madame Stroud turned sharply. "What now?" An unspeakable in soot-marked robes burst through the door, breathing hard and visibly shaken. "The lower archive," he said. "The wall opened." Vale went utterly still. "What wall?" "The one behind Chamber 9, the wizard said. "The sealed one. We did not touch it. It opened on its own." The silence that followed was brief and terrible. Then Vale looked at Alara. "Now," he said, "you will see why legend is no comfort at all." And without another word he strode from the chamber, while the others followed into the blue-lit corridor, toward a door that had not opened in living memory, and toward whatever patient thing had begun at last to reach back from the dark. The corridor beyond Chamber 9 had never been intended for regular passage, and even among those who worked in the Department of Mysteries, it was spoken of only in fragments, as though the act of naming it too clearly might invite attention from something that preferred to remain undisturbed. And as Alara followed Septimus Vale through the narrowing passage, she felt with growing certainty that this was not a place shaped for human comfort, but rather a boundary drawn long ago to keep something contained. The wall in question stood half open at the far end, its ancient stone edges parted with a slow and unnatural precision, as though it had not crumbled or been forced, but had simply decided to yield after centuries of silence, and the darkness beyond it did not behave like ordinary shadow, for it seemed to absorb the faint blue light from the corridor instead of reflecting it, creating a depth that resisted the eye and made distance impossible to judge. No one spoke at first, because there are moments when even the most practiced minds understand that silence carries more weight than questions, and this was such a moment. Vale raised his wand and murmured an incantation so soft that Alara could not catch the words. Yet at once a pale sphere of light formed at its tip, casting a steady glow that pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal a narrow chamber beyond the broken wall, lined with stone older than the ministry itself, marked with symbols so worn they might have been mistaken for natural cracks, if not for their faint, deliberate pattern. "These carvings," Vale said quietly, though his voice carried the controlled tension of a man forcing calm upon himself, "do not belong to any recorded magical language in Britain, nor to any of the known European systems, and every attempt to translate them has failed, though they appear consistently wherever these relics are found." Corbin stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "Then how do you know they are not merely decorative?" "Because they repeat," Vale replied, "and repetition implies intent." Alara moved closer to the threshold, resisting the instinct that urged her to remain where she stood, for she had learned long ago that fear, when left unchallenged, grew stronger in silence, and yet as she crossed into the chamber, she felt a subtle pressure in the air, as though the space itself acknowledged her presence in a way no ordinary room could. "What was this place used for?" she asked. Vale did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before. "We do not know," he said, "but we suspect it was not built by the ministry, and not by any institution that wished its purpose to be remembered." The unspeakable who had raised the alarm pointed toward the far side of the chamber, where the light revealed a shallow recess carved into the stone, within which lay a circular indentation, empty now, though its edges bore the faint outline of something that had once rested there. "The disc was here," he said. "The spiral stone. It is gone." Ilara's thoughts sharpened at once. "Gone where?" "We do not know," he replied. "The wards did not break. No one entered. It is simply not here." Corbin exhaled slowly. "So we have an object that moves without being moved, a wall that opens without being opened, and voices that speak without speaking. This grows tiresome." "On the contrary," said Vale, his gaze fixed on the empty recess. "It grows clearer." Ilara turned to him. "Then explain it." Vale stepped closer to the recess, kneeling beside it as though examining a wound in the stone, and when he spoke, his words carried the quiet certainty of a conclusion reached against his own preference. "These relics are not merely passive," he said. "They are not tools waiting for a wielder. They are anchors, each one bound to something beyond our understanding, and when the conditions are right, they act to re-establish that connection, even if it requires altering the world around them." Ilara felt the implication settle heavily in her mind. "You mean they are trying to reconnect with whatever made them?" "Yes," Vale said, "or with whatever used them." A faint sound echoed from deeper within the chamber, so soft that it might have been mistaken for the shifting of stone. Yet it carried a rhythm too deliberate to be dismissed, and every wand in the room rose at once, drawn by instinct rather than command. Corbin moved to Ilara's side. "Tell me you heard that." "I did," she replied, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. The sound came again, this time clearer, like the distant murmur of voices layered upon one another, too faint to distinguish words, yet unmistakably present. And as it spread through the chamber, the carvings along the walls seemed to catch the light differently, their worn edges sharpening just enough to suggest that they had not been entirely dormant. Vale rose slowly. "We are not alone here." "That much is obvious," Corbin said, though there was less irritation in his tone now, and more calculation, as though he had begun to accept the rules of a game he did not like. Ilara stepped towards the source of the sound, though every instinct warned her against it, for the darkness beyond the reach of Vale's light seemed to deepen with each step, and yet she could not shake the sense that whatever lay ahead was not merely waiting, but observing. The murmuring grew louder, not in volume, but in clarity, as though the distance between listener and speaker were shrinking, and though she could not understand the words, she felt their shape pressing against her thoughts, probing gently at first, and then with increasing insistence, like a hand testing the strength of a locked door. She stopped abruptly. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Vale nodded. "It is a tempting contact." Corbin's grip on his wand tightened. "Then we should not encourage it." "No," Vale said, "but neither can we retreat without understanding what we face, because ignorance will not protect us from something that has already begun to act." The murmuring shifted, and for a single, fleeting instant, Ilara thought she understood a fragment of it, not as a word, but as an impression so clear it struck her like a memory that did not belong to her. Waiting. The thought passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a cold certainty that whatever intelligence lay beyond the darkness wasn't newly awakened, but had been aware for far longer than anyone had guessed. Suddenly, one of the torches along the wall flickered, its blue flame bending inward as though drawn by an unseen force, and at the same moment the air in the chamber grew heavier, pressing against Alara's chest with a weight that made breathing feel strangely difficult. "Something is changing," she said. Vale's eyes widened slightly. "It is strengthening the connection." "To what?" Corbin demanded. Vale did not answer at once, and when he did, his voice carried a note of grim understanding. "To us." The murmuring surged, and this time it was not distant but immediate, filling the chamber with a presence that seemed to brush against every mind in the room, not with violence, but with an eerie, deliberate curiosity, as though testing the shape of human thought. One of the unspeakables staggered, his wand dropping from his hand as he clutched his head. "It's inside," he gasped. "I can feel it." Before he could finish, Vale raised his wand and cast a sharp, precise charm that struck the wizard's chest with a flash of silver light, breaking whatever connection had begun to form, and the murmuring receded at once, though it did not vanish entirely. Alara stepped back, her pulse racing. "It can reach us without the relic." "Yes," Vale said, his expression darkening, "which means the relic was never the source." Corbin looked toward the empty recess. "Then what is?" Vale turned slowly toward the darkness beyond the chamber, his gaze fixed on something none of them could yet see. "The door," he said. At that moment, the wall behind them shuddered, the stone grinding softly as the opening began to close, not swiftly, but with the same calm inevitability with which it had first opened, as though guided by a will that did not require haste. "Move," Corbin snapped. They turned as one and hurried toward the narrowing gap, the murmuring rising once more behind them, no longer faint or distant, but layered with a new and unmistakable tone. Recognition. Alara crossed the threshold just as the wall sealed itself with a final, echoing sound, cutting off the darkness and the voices alike. Yet the silence that followed brought no relief, because she knew with quiet certainty that whatever lay beyond had not been contained again. It had simply chosen to wait. And now, for the first time, it knew they were there. The silence that followed the sealing of the stone wall did not carry the comfort of safety, but rather the strained stillness of something that had merely withdrawn its hand without relinquishing its grip. And as Alara Vance stood in the dim corridor outside Chamber 9, she felt with growing certainty that whatever intelligence had stirred beyond that threshold had not been contained by the closing of the passage, but had instead marked them in some quiet and deliberate way that would not easily be undone. For a long moment, no one spoke, because each witch and wizard present seemed occupied with the same unspoken realization that the Ministry of Magic, long believed to be the heart of order and control within the wizarding world, had become host to something older than its own foundations, something that did not recognize authority, rank, or law, and therefore could not be reasoned with by any means the ministry had ever relied upon. It was Corbin Hale who first broke the silence, though his voice carried less impatience than before, and more of a measured caution, as though he had begun to tread upon ground that might not support his weight. "Well," he said, glancing toward the sealed wall, "if that was not the source, then we have been searching in the wrong direction from the start." Septimus Vale inclined his head slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on the stone, as if expecting it to move again at any moment. "Not the wrong direction," he said, "but an incomplete one, because we assumed these relics were the origin of the disturbance, when in truth they are merely the remnants of something that continues to act beyond their presence." Ilara folded her arms, her thoughts moving quickly despite the lingering pressure at the edges of her mind. "Then we are not dealing with objects," she said, "but with an intelligence that uses them as anchors, which means removing the relics will not end this unless we find the point where that intelligence enters our world." Vale turned to her, and for the first time there was something like approval in his expression. "Precisely," he said, "and that point must lie deeper still, in a place the Ministry has either forgotten or never fully understood." Madame Stroud gave a quiet, dissatisfied breath. "The Ministry does not forget its own structure." Vale did not argue, but instead raised his wand and traced a slow circle in the air, causing a faint projection of shifting lines and corridors to appear before them, a layered map of the lower levels that extended beyond the familiar layout of offices and chambers into a web of passages that seemed to twist upon themselves in ways that defied ordinary architectural sense. "This," he said, "is the most complete representation we have of the substructure beneath the Department of Mysteries, and even this is based on partial surveys, fragmented records, and the recollections of unspeakables who have not all agreed on what they saw." Corbin stepped closer, studying the projection with narrowed eyes. "Some of these passages overlap." "Yes," Vale said, "and some do not exist at all, depending on when they are observed." Ilara felt a faint tightening in her chest. "You are telling us the structure itself is unstable." "I am telling you," Vale replied, "that the deeper we go, the less the Ministry resembles a place built by human design, and the more it resembles something that has been layered over older foundations whose purpose we do not comprehend." The projection shifted, and Vale indicated a cluster of faintly glowing lines far beneath their current position. "These chambers," he said, "have no recorded entry points, yet they appear consistently in every mapping attempt, though never in precisely the same location, and it is near this region that the disturbances have grown strongest since the relic moved." Madame Stroud crossed her arms. "And you have never attempted to reach them?" Vale met her gaze evenly. "We have attempted many things. None have succeeded." Ilara stepped closer to the projection, her eyes tracing the shifting lines. "Then we attempt differently," she said. "If the structure is not fixed, then perhaps the path is not physical in the way we expect." Corbin gave her a sidelong glance. "You intend to walk through walls now?" "No," Ilara said, her voice steady. "But I have seen magic that responds not to force, but to recognition, and if this place is tied to whatever intelligence we encountered, then perhaps it can be reached by the same means through which it reaches us." Vale regarded her thoughtfully. "You propose allowing it to guide us?" "I propose," she replied, "that we stop pretending we are entirely in control of this situation, because it is already clear that we are not." The words settled heavily in the corridor, and though no one voiced agreement at once, neither did anyone dismiss the idea, for the events of the past hour had stripped away the comfort of ordinary explanations, leaving behind only the stark necessity of adapting to something far less predictable. At last, Vale gave a slow nod. "There is a method," he said, "though it is not without risk, because it involves entering a state of partial attunement to the influence we felt in the chamber, allowing it to establish a controlled connection that may reveal the path we seek." Corbin's expression darkened. "You mean letting it into our minds?" "For a moment," Vale said, "under strict containment." Madame Stroud's voice sharpened. Absolutely not. If we do nothing, Vale replied calmly, the connection will strengthen regardless of our consent, and we will face it without preparation rather than by design. Elara looked between them, then spoke with quiet certainty. We do it, she said. Corbin studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. If you are going to risk your mind, I am not standing aside. Madame Stroud exhaled slowly, as though measuring the weight of a decision she did not wish to make. Very well, she said at last, but I will oversee the containment, and if I believe for even a moment that control is slipping, I will end the attempt without hesitation. Vale inclined his head. That is acceptable. They moved to a wider chamber nearby, where protective wards could be layered without interference from the shifting corridors, and within minutes, the space was transformed into a circle of controlled magic, its boundaries marked by lines of silver light that pulsed faintly against the stone floor, while charms of shielding and separation formed a lattice overhead, isolating the center from external influence as much as such a thing could be achieved. Elara stepped into the circle first, her wand held loosely at her side, though her grip remained steady, while Corbin took his place opposite her, his posture rigid but controlled, and Vale stood just beyond the boundary, ready to guide the process with the careful precision of one who had walked too close to dangerous knowledge before. Do not resist the initial contact, Vale said, his voice low and deliberate, but do not yield to it either, because you must remain aware of yourselves, even as it attempts to draw you further. Elara nodded once. I understand. Vale raised his wand, and the silver lines around them brightened. Begin. For a moment, nothing happened, and Elara wondered whether the connection would come at all. But then, slowly, and with a subtlety that made it all the more unsettling, the familiar pressure returned, brushing against her thoughts like a distant echo that grew clearer with each passing heartbeat. The chamber seemed to fade, not vanishing entirely, but receding into the background of her awareness, while something else took its place, something vast and indistinct, yet undeniably present. The murmuring began again. This time it was closer. Not around her. Within her. She held her ground, forcing her thoughts into steady patterns, refusing to let the presence scatter them, and for a brief, fragile moment, there was balance, a narrow space in which she could perceive without being consumed. Then the murmuring shifted. It became a direction. Not spoken, not seen, but known. A pull. Downward. Deeper than any corridor she had walked. Deeper than any chamber the ministry had mapped. And in that moment, Elara understood with chilling clarity that the path they sought did not lie ahead of them, nor behind, nor even within the shifting maze of the Department of Mysteries, but beneath it all, in a place where the ministry had never truly held dominion. Her breath caught slightly, though her stance did not falter. I see it, she said. Across from her. Corbin's expression tightened. So do I. Vale stepped closer, his voice urgent now. Hold the connection. Do not let it deepen. Elara nodded faintly, though her focus remained fixed on the invisible path that stretched downward into darkness. It is not guiding us, she said slowly. It is showing us where it already is. The words had barely left her when the pressure surged, stronger than before, and for a single dangerous instant, the boundary between observer and observed blurred, as though whatever lay beneath had turned its attention fully upon them. And in that instant, it recognized them again, The moment of recognition did not pass like an ordinary sensation, but remained suspended within Ilara's mind like a bell note that should have faded, and yet continued to tremble through her thoughts. And although the silver ward lines still burned around the chamber, and she could hear the measured cadence of Septimus Vale's instructions somewhere beyond the pressure closing in upon her, she understood with immediate and dreadful certainty that the thing beneath the ministry had not merely sensed two intruders reaching toward it, but had turned with intent toward two distinct human minds and fixed them there as one might mark a door worth opening later. "Break the contact," Madame Stroud said sharply from beyond the circle, and at once Vale's wand flashed, sending a lattice of pale fire through the containment charms, while Ilara felt the pressure wrench backward with a resistance that was not physical, but personal, as though a hand had seized the edge of her thoughts and did not wish to release them. She staggered when the connection finally snapped, though she did not fall, and across from her Corbin dropped to one knee, one hand braced against the stone floor while his face had gone white beneath the dim light of the warded chamber. For several breaths no one moved toward them, because the containment rules mattered more than comfort in a place like this, and only when Vale had spoken a second incantation and the silver lines dulled from bright flame to a quieter glow did Madame Stroud step forward, her expression hard with vigilance rather than alarm. "What did you see?" she asked, not wasting a word on whether they were well. Ilara drew in a slow breath, forcing the last of the pressure from her chest before she answered. "Not a place at first," she said, "but a direction, and not through the mapped corridors either, because whatever lies beneath the ministry is lower than the Department of Mysteries and older than the foundations built around it, and the path to it is hidden inside the structure rather than beneath it in any ordinary sense." Corbin rose unsteadily, still breathing harder than usual, though the irritation that often sharpened his features had given way to something more severe. "It was waiting," he said, his voice low. "Not asleep, not trapped. Waiting, and it knew at once that we were looking for it." Vale's expression did not change, yet Ilara saw the weight of their answer settle on him. "That confirms what I feared," he said. "The intelligence below is not an echo attached to artifacts, nor a residue of old magic caught in stone, but an active presence with awareness enough to perceive inquiry and respond." Madame Stroud folded her arms tightly. "Then the next question is simple, and I should very much like a useful answer. How do we reach it before it reaches us again?" Vale turned toward the projected map still hovering above the center table, and with one movement of his wand, he altered the display so that the known corridors faded, while only the deepest, least reliable traces remained, flickering like uncertain veins of light beneath a body that did not wish to be studied. "The lower chambers were never accessed through doors in the conventional sense," he said. "Every record we possess that even hints at them refers instead to thresholds, which suggests passage governed by condition rather than location." "Oh," Ilara stepped from the circle and joined him, feeling the lingering chill of that contact still threaded through her thoughts. "Condition," she repeated. "Meaning what?" Vale hesitated briefly, which told her he disliked the answer as much as she expected to. "Recognition, invitation, sequence, sacrifice, or magical state," he said. "Ancient systems were seldom as straightforward as keyed locks, particularly when built to restrict access to particular kinds of witch or wizard." Corbin gave him a flat look. "You are suggesting that the place chooses who may enter?" "In effect," said Vale. "Yes." Madame Stroud's mouth tightened. "Marvelous." Ilara kept her gaze on the shifting map. "When the connection formed, I did not only feel the direction. I felt layers, as though the ministry had been built above a wound and papered over it with offices, records, and corridors, until everyone forgot what the ground beneath them truly was. Vale glanced at her. A wound is one metaphor the older fragments use. She looked up sharply. You have fragments you did not mention. I have fragments I could not verify, he said. Most are broken references preserved in confiscated manuscripts from the 17th and 18th centuries, copied from sources already older than the copies themselves, and several describe the earliest magical authorities in Britain as inheritors rather than founders, as though the first central powers of wizarding governance did not choose this site freely, but settled here because something older had already marked it as important. Corbin's expression darkened. Then the ministry was built over this knowingly? Not the present ministry, Vale said. Perhaps not even the earliest ministry in its formal sense, but someone new, someone sufficiently cautious to seal, divide, and disguise. Ilara felt a hard clarity begin to take shape, because mysteries often remained shapeless only until the right pattern emerged, and once it did, the truth started arranging lesser facts around itself. The relics were not hidden merely to study them, she said. They were separated because together they do something. Vale met her gaze, and this time he nodded at once. That is my belief. Madame Stroud turned toward the table where the recovered objects lay behind layered wards. Then we destroy them. No, Vale said with unusual force. Not until we understand the mechanism of connection, because if they are anchors or keys, then breaking them blindly may not sever the path at all. It could widen it. That silenced the room for a moment. Corbin stepped to the artifacts and studied them one by one through the veil of shimmering protection. The chipped stone disc with its worn spiral carving, the blackened chain, the tarnished goblet, the pale silver-lit shard, and, newly added since Ilara had last looked, a ring of dull metal inscribed on the inside with lines so fine they vanished whenever she tried to focus on them directly. That was not here before, she said. Vale looked toward the ring. It was recovered 20 minutes ago from a hidden recess behind a sealed file archive on level 1, in the same annex where the staff collapsed. Madame Stroud swore under her breath. So the ministry is still producing relics as we speak. Not producing, said Vale quietly. Revealing. Ilara studied the objects together, and the impression came to her not through reason alone, but through the same lingering intuition that the contact below had left behind. The disc is not the key, she said, nor the shard. It is the set. Corbin glanced at her. Explain. She stepped closer to the wards, careful not to touch them. These do not feel alike in function, only in origin. The disc feels like a marker, the chain a binding, the goblet a vessel, the shard a fragment of something broken, and the ring. She paused, because even describing it felt strangely unpleasant. The ring feels like permission. Vale's face changed very slightly. That aligns with a phrase from one of the fragments. Which phrase? Madame Stroud asked. He answered without taking his eyes from Ilara. The first reign does not begin with conquest, but with consent misnamed. Corbin let out a humorless breath. Consent misnamed sounds very much like possession dressed as law. Yes, said Vale. And if these objects together form a ritual structure, then the danger is not that something below the ministry will burst through by force, but that it will establish lawful entry through witches and wizards persuaded, compelled, or altered into granting it passage. The conflict, which had already been grave, sharpened into something colder and more urgent, because an enemy that needed brute power could sometimes be opposed at the gate, while one that required permission would first turn the minds of those in charge, and the ministry was built of nothing if not signatures, authority, and acts declared valid by the proper wand and seal. "It is already happening," Ilara said. "The officials hearing voices, the workers losing time, the phrase spoken in the records annex, the feeling of being watched and directed. It is testing minds, choosing weaknesses, and preparing someone to open the next threshold willingly." Madame Stroud's reply was immediate. "Then we identify who is most exposed." "We may already be too late," Vale said. Before anyone could answer, the chamber door opened with a crack of hurried movement, and a young witch from internal security entered, breathing fast and pale with the effort of having run through several wards without stopping. "Madame Stroud," she said, and though she tried to keep her voice even, fear frayed it at the edges. "There has been another incident. The acting minister has disappeared." For one heartbeat, the words seemed not to land, perhaps because they were too direct to feel real. Yet Madame Stroud was moving before the silence had fully formed. "From where?" "His office," said the witch. "No signs of struggle, no apparition trace, no flu use, and the protective detail outside swears he never came out. His desk was found cleared except for one object." Vale's eyes narrowed. "Which object?" The witch swallowed. The minister's seal. Something in Ilara's mind clicked into place with such force that the answer felt less like a deduction than a revelation long assembling itself in shadow. "It has chosen him," she said. Corbin turned sharply. "Because he can authorize anything." "Because he can authorize everything," Ilara replied. Vale's face had gone very still. "The consent misnamed." Madame Stroud drew her wand. "Then we move now, before whatever took him gains what it needs." "Not blindly," said Vale, though urgency had entered his voice at last. "If the minister has been taken below, the threshold will already be opening, and if that happens through formal magical authority, the old protections may interpret it as legitimacy." Corbin looked from the missing seal to the relics and back again. "Then we stop treating this as a haunting and start treating it as a coup." No one disagreed. Ilara's thoughts were already racing ahead, assembling the emerging shape of the danger with grim precision. The first ones, whatever they truly were, did not seek to shatter the ministry. They sought to inherit it. They were taking minds, gathering relics, and now they had reached for the one wizard whose office embodied legal permission at the highest level. If they succeeded in using him to cross whatever threshold lay beneath the Department of Mysteries, then the old reign hinted at in broken texts would not return through open war, but through the machinery of governance itself. She turned to Vale. "There must be a place where the seal can be used in conjunction with the relics." "There is," he said, and for the first time he sounded like a man naming a truth he had hoped not to speak aloud. "A chamber described only once, in a confiscated manuscript too damaged for certainty, called the Hall of First Accord." Madame Stroud's eyes hardened. "And you know where it is?" "No," Vale said, "but I know how it is reached." He looked directly at Ilara and Corbin. "The threshold does not open to command," he said. "It opens to a living bearer of ministry authority, and to those already marked by the intelligence below." Corbin gave a grim, slight nod. "Then that would be us." Ilara understood at once what he meant, and felt no temptation to deny it, because the presence beneath the ministry had already recognized them, and whatever trace that contact had left upon their minds had become not merely a danger, but a path. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of it. "And if the minister has been taken through, then our mark may be the only way to follow before the door closes again." Beyond the chamber walls, the ministry continued its unseen motions of lifts, parchment, guarded corridors, and hidden panic. Yet all of that now seemed like the upper surface of something far deeper and more fragile than anyone above could guess. And as Vale began gathering the relics into shielded cases, while Madame Stroud summoned trusted agents by Patronus and Corbin checked the charges on his defensive charms, with swift, practiced precision, Ilara felt the story of the night narrowing toward a harder path. They were no longer searching for signs. They were going after the thing itself, into the place where authority, ancient magic, and human consent had first been bound together, and where the fate of the ministry would be decided not by speeches, committees, or public duels beneath enchanted ceilings, but in the dark below, where the oldest bargains still remembered their price. The descent began not with a door or a stair, but with a silence that deepened until it seemed to press against the very fabric of thought. And as Ilara Vance followed Septimus Vale and Corbin Hale through the dim corridors beneath the Department of Mysteries, she felt with growing certainty that they were no longer moving through the ministry in any ordinary sense, but were instead passing along a boundary where intention mattered more than distance, and where the familiar laws governing space had begun to loosen their hold. The relics had been secured within layered containment charms, each object encased in a sphere of shifting light that hovered at Vale's side, like silent sentinels. And although no one spoke of it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding among them that these items were no longer merely evidence, but participants in whatever would unfold below, and that their presence might either unlock the path they sought or hasten the very outcome they wished to prevent. Madame Stroud had remained above with a contingent of trusted witches and wizards, sealing off access points and isolating departments where influence had already taken root, while Ilara, Corbin, and Vale had been chosen to proceed, not because they were the most expendable, but because they were already touched, already recognized, and therefore uniquely able to follow where others could not. They reached a narrow passage that did not appear on any map, its entrance revealed only after Vale had traced a careful sequence of spells along an otherwise unremarkable stretch of stone. And even then it did not open fully, but shifted just enough to allow passage, as though reluctant to admit them, and yet unable to refuse. "This is as far as recorded access goes," Vale said quietly, though his voice carried a note of tension that had not been present before. "And beyond this point, we rely entirely on what we experienced during the connection." Corbin gave a short, humorless breath. "Then let us hope our unwelcome acquaintance below remains consistent in its directions." Ilara stepped forward, feeling again that faint, unsettling pull that had guided her thoughts during the controlled contact. And though she could not see a path in any ordinary sense, she sensed a direction as clearly as if it had been marked by light, a downward inclination that drew her forward without the need for explanation. "This way," she said, and though she did not look back, she knew they followed. The passage narrowed as they advanced, its walls shifting subtly with each step, not enough to disorient, but enough to suggest that the space itself was not fixed, and that they were being permitted passage rather than simply taking it. And as they moved deeper, the air grew colder, not with the natural chill of underground stone, but with a stillness that seemed to drain warmth rather than merely lack it. After several minutes that felt longer than they should have, the passage opened into a chamber unlike any Ilara had seen within the ministry, for it was neither circular nor square, but formed of intersecting planes that met at angles too precise to be accidental and too irregular to be comfortable, while the floor bore faint markings that echoed the worn symbols they had seen earlier, though here they were clearer, sharper, as though less time had passed since their making. At the center of the chamber stood a low structure of pale stone, shaped like a shallow basin, and within it rested a thin layer of dark liquid that did not ripple or reflect, but lay perfectly still, as though untouched by gravity or motion. Vale stopped at the threshold, his expression tightening. This chamber was never recorded. Corbin scanned the walls, his wand held ready. Then we have gone where no one else has. Elara stepped closer to the basin, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by that same persistent sense of direction that had guided them thus far. And as she approached, she felt the faintest whisper of that presence again, not as strong as before, but unmistakably aware. "It is watching us," she said softly. Vale moved beside her, his gaze fixed on the dark surface of the basin. "Then we proceed carefully, because observation often precedes action." The relics at his side shifted slightly, their containment spheres pulsing in faint response to the chamber's presence. And for a moment, Elara had the distinct impression that the objects were not merely reacting, but aligning, as though each had a place within a pattern not yet fully revealed. "The basin," she said slowly, "it is not empty." Corbin frowned. "It appears empty enough." "No," Elara replied, her voice steady despite the unease stirring within her. "It is not empty. It is waiting." Vale's eyes flicked toward her. "Explain." She hesitated only briefly, searching for the right words to describe what she felt rather than what she saw. "It feels like a point of passage," she said. "Not a door in the ordinary sense, but something that connects here to somewhere deeper, and the liquid." She paused, because even thinking of it unsettled her. "The liquid is not meant to be disturbed. It is meant to receive." Corbin's expression darkened. "Receive what?" Before Elara could answer, the chamber shifted. Not violently, not with any visible motion, but with a subtle realignment that made the walls seem closer and the air heavier, and at the same moment the surface of the dark liquid rippled for the first time, though no one had touched it. A low sound followed, not quite a voice, but close enough to stir memory and recognition at once. Vale's wand rose instantly. "It is responding." The ripples deepened, spreading outward in slow, deliberate circles, and within them shapes began to form. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to suggest movement beneath the surface, as though something lay just beyond sight, pressing upward against a barrier too thin to be entirely secure. Elara felt the pull strengthen. "It is here," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Closer than before." Corbin stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the basin. "Then we do not give it what it wants." Vale did not lower his wand, but his gaze remained fixed on the shifting surface. "It may not be a matter of what we wish to give," he said, "but of what it has already taken." At that moment, a figure emerged from the darkness at the far side of the chamber, not stepping through a door or passage, but appearing gradually, as though resolving from shadow into substance. And when Elara saw who it was, a sharp tension ran through her chest. Acting Minister Julian Crew stood at the edge of the basin, his posture rigid, his expression calm in a way that did not belong to him, and in his hand he held the minister's seal, its polished surface catching the dim light with an unnatural gleam. "Minister," Corbin said sharply, "step away from the basin." Crew did not respond. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward them, and though his eyes were open and clear, there was something within them that did not belong to the man they had known. "Elara Vance," he said, his voice measured and composed, yet layered with a faint resonance that did not match his own tone. You have come more quickly than expected." A chill ran through the chamber. Vale stepped forward slightly, his wand steady. "You are not alone within that mind." Crew smiled faintly, though the expression held no warmth. "No mind is ever truly alone," he said. "Yours will learn this in time." Ilara forced herself to remain steady, though the presence she had felt before now pressed more insistently against her thoughts, drawn perhaps by the proximity of the man before them. "Let him go," she said. "Whatever you are, you do not belong here." Crew tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words with distant amusement. "We belong where we are remembered," he replied, "and where we are invited." Corbin's grip tightened on his wand. "You were not invited." Crew's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment the calm surface of his expression darkened. "Authority speaks invitation whether it intends to or not," he said. "Power acknowledges power, and the seal in my hand carries the weight of that acknowledgement." Vale's voice sharpened. "You are attempting to legitimize entry through the authority of the ministry." Crew inclined his head slightly. "Not attempting." The basin stirred again, its dark surface rising slightly as though responding to the presence of the seal, and the shapes beneath it grew clearer, though still indistinct, like shadows seen through water. Ilara's heart quickened. "If he completes whatever this is," she said, "the threshold will open." "Yes," Vale said quietly, "and not in a way we can easily close." Corbin took a step forward. "Then we stop him now." But Ilara did not move. Instead, she looked at the relics hovering beside Vale, at the basin, at the seal in Crew's hand, and at the faint, shifting patterns along the chamber floor, and in that moment the pieces aligned in her mind with sudden and dangerous clarity. "This is not just a ritual," she said. "It is a sequence." Vale turned to her. "Go on." "The relics each represent a part of it," she said. "Marker, binding, vessel, fragment, permission, and the seal." She looked at Crew. "The seal completes it." Corbin frowned. "Completes what?" Ilara met his gaze. "The first accord," she said. The chamber seemed to tighten around them as the truth settled into place, and Crew's faint smile deepened, not with satisfaction alone, but with recognition. "Yes," he said softly. "You understand more quickly than the others did." Vale's expression hardened. "Then we have little time left?" Ilara nodded once, her resolve firm despite the danger closing in around them. "Then we end the sequence," she said, "before it ends us." And, as the basin stirred once more, and the presence beneath it pressed closer to the surface, the confrontation that would decide the fate of the ministry began to take its final shape. The chamber seemed to draw inward upon itself, as though aware that the moment of decision had arrived, and the stillness that followed Ilara's words did not resemble hesitation, but rather the poised calm of forces aligning toward a single and irreversible act, while the faint rippling of the basin deepened into a slow, deliberate motion that suggested not agitation, but readiness. Julian Crew, or what remained of him, stood unmoving at the edge of the dark surface, the minister's seal held steadily in his hand, and though his posture remained composed, there was an unnatural precision to his stillness, as though every movement he might make had already been measured and chosen long before the present moment. And Ilara felt with growing certainty that whatever intelligence guided him did not rely upon haste, because it had waited far longer than any living wizard could comprehend. "You believe you can interrupt what has already begun?" Crew said, his voice carrying that same faint resonance, like an echo layered beneath the words. Yet you do not understand that the sequence is not imposed from without, but awakened from within, and what is awakened cannot be undone by denial alone. Corbin Hale stepped forward, his wand raised with unwavering intent, though the tension in his stance betrayed the strain of facing an enemy that did not present a single target or form. "Then we shall attempt something stronger than denial," he said, his voice low and controlled, "because whatever holds him will release him when it is forced to do so." Vale moved beside him, though his focus remained divided between Crew and the relics suspended at his side, which had begun to pulse more strongly now, their containment fields reacting not merely to the chamber, but to the presence of the seal itself, as though the final piece of a long separated pattern had been brought within reach. "Force will not suffice," Vale said quietly, "because the process we are witnessing is not a spell in the ordinary sense, but a convergence of conditions that must be broken at their root, or else any disruption we achieve will be temporary at best." Ilara's gaze moved from Crew to the basin, then to the relics and back again, her thoughts moving with sharp clarity despite the pressure building within her mind, for the presence beneath the chamber had grown more distinct, no longer a distant awareness, but a patient and deliberate intelligence that pressed against the edges of her perception with a steady and unrelenting focus. "It is not enough to stop him," she said. "We must break the sequence itself." Corbin glanced at her. "And how do you propose we do that, when we do not yet understand the full structure of it?" Ilara took a slow breath, steadying herself against the growing pull of that unseen force. "We understand enough," she said. "The relics each serve a purpose, and together they form the structure of the accord, but the sequence requires all of them to function as one, which means if we disrupt even one element at the right moment, the entire process may collapse." Vale's expression sharpened. "Yes, but the timing must be exact, because once the seal is used to formalize the accord, the process will no longer depend on the physical arrangement of the relics." Crew's faint smile returned, though it held no warmth. "You speak as though time remains abundant," he said, "yet the threshold opens even now." The basin responded as he spoke, its surface rising slightly, the dark liquid forming slow, deliberate shapes that suggested depth far greater than the shallow vessel could contain. And within those shifting forms, something moved, not with violence, but with a measured and inevitable advance, as though it approached the surface not to break through, but to be received. Ilara felt the pull intensify. "It is closer," she said. "The sequence is nearing completion." Corbin's voice hardened. "Then we act now." He raised his wand, aiming directly at Crew, but before he could cast, Vale spoke sharply. "Wait," he said. "If you strike him now, you may disrupt the wrong element, and the sequence will adapt." Corbin's jaw tightened. "Then choose the right one, because we are out of time." Ilara stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the relics. "The ring," she said. Vale turned to her. "Why the ring?" "Because it represents permission," she replied, "and permission is the final condition that allows everything else to proceed, because without it, the accord cannot be established, no matter how many other elements are present." Vale considered this for only a moment before nodding. "Yes," he said. "If the ring is removed from the sequence before the seal is applied, the process may fail to complete." Corbin exhaled slowly. "Then we remove it." Crew's gaze shifted toward the relics, and for a brief instant, the calm mask of his expression flickered, revealing something sharper beneath. "You believe you understand the structure," he said. Yet you fail to see that permission is not bound to a single object, but to the will that grants it. Elara met his gaze, her voice steady. Then we will see whether your will remains your own. Before Crew could respond, she moved. Her wand rose in a swift, precise motion, and a sharp, cutting charm struck the containment sphere around the ring, not breaking it entirely, but disrupting its balance just enough to cause the relic within to shift violently, its surface flashing with a brief, unsettling light. At the same moment, Corbin cast a binding charm toward Crew, aiming not to harm, but to restrain, while Vale extended his wand toward the basin, weaving a complex pattern of counter-charms designed to stabilize the shifting energy within it. For a heartbeat, everything held. Then the chamber reacted. The basin surged upward, the dark liquid rising in a sudden, unnatural swell, while the relics pulsed violently within their containment fields, and a sound filled the air. Not quite a scream, but close enough to send a sharp jolt through every mind present, as though something beneath the surface had been denied at the very moment of its arrival. Crew staggered, the seal in his hand trembling slightly, and for the first time, his expression fractured, revealing a flicker of confusion that did not belong to the presence controlling him. Elara pressed forward, seizing the moment. Now, she said. Corbin's binding charm tightened, forcing Crew backward from the edge of the basin, while Vale's counter-charms intensified, weaving a barrier of silver light across the surface of the dark liquid, disrupting its motion and forcing it downward. For an instant, it seemed as though they had succeeded. Then the presence responded. The pressure returned with greater force than before, not as a distant influence, but as a direct and overwhelming presence that filled the chamber, pressing against every thought, every memory, every fragment of will. And within that pressure there was no anger, no panic, but only a vast and patient insistence, as though the interruption had not ended the process, but merely delayed it. Crew's head lifted slowly, and though the confusion in his expression remained, it was fading, replaced once more by that unnatural calm. "You delay," he said softly, "but you do not prevent." The seal in his hand began to glow, its surface catching the dim light of the chamber and reflecting it in a way that did not belong to ordinary magic. And as it did, the basin responded again, the dark liquid pressing upward against the barrier Vale had cast, not breaking it, but testing it, seeking weakness. Elara felt her resolve tighten. "We have not broken the sequence," she said, "but we have unbalanced it." Vale nodded, though strain had entered his voice. "Yes, and that may be enough, if we can force a collapse before it stabilizes again." Corbin glanced between them. "Then tell me how." Elara's gaze returned to the relics, then to the basin, and finally to Crew, whose grip on the seal had begun to tighten once more. "The sequence requires alignment," she said. "Not just of objects, but of intent, authority, and acceptance." Vale's eyes sharpened. "Then if we break the authority—" "The accord cannot be completed," Elara finished. Corbin's expression hardened. "Then we take the seal." Before anyone could object, he moved. With a swift and decisive motion, he advanced on Crew, his wand flashing as he cast a disarming charm aimed directly at the minister's hand, and for a moment it seemed as though the spell would succeed, the seal lifting slightly from Crew's grasp. But then the presence intervened. The air itself seemed to resist the spell, bending around it in a way that defied ordinary magical interaction, and the seal did not fly free, but remained in Crew's hand, as though held there by something far stronger than physical grip. Corbin's eyes narrowed. That will not work. No, Vale said, his voice tense, because the authority it represents is not merely symbolic, it is recognized by the structure we are facing. Ilara's thoughts raced. Then we do not take it, she said. We deny it. Both men looked at her. How? Corbin demanded. Ilara stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Crew. By refusing the authority it carries, she said. If the accord depends on recognition, then we must break that recognition, not by force, but by rejection. Vale's expression shifted slightly. You mean? Yes, Ilara said. We declare the authority invalid. Corbin frowned. That is not how ministry law works. No, Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the rising pressure in the chamber. But this is not ministry law. This is something older. Crew's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something beneath the calm surface, something that might have been interest. You would deny authority in its own seat, he said, a bold choice. Ilara did not look away. I would deny any authority that is not freely given, she said. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. And deep beneath the surface of the basin, something shifted. For a single suspended moment, the chamber seemed to gather itself around Ilara's words, as though the ancient structure hidden beneath the ministry had not merely heard her defiance, but had paused to weigh it against laws far older than any charter or decree ever signed within the wizarding world. And in that stillness, the dark surface of the basin ceased its restless motion, becoming once more unnaturally calm, as though something beneath it had turned its full attention upward. Julian Crew stood unmoving, the minister's seal still clasped in his hand. Yet the faint, unnatural glow that had begun to gather around it dimmed slightly, flickering as though the certainty behind its authority had been disturbed in some subtle but significant way. And though the presence within him did not retreat, it seemed for the first time to hesitate, not in weakness, but in calculation. Septimus Vale lowered his wand only a fraction, his gaze fixed intently on Ilara, as though recognizing that the nature of the confrontation had shifted from force to something far more precarious, where words carried weight equal to spells and intent shaped reality in ways that ordinary magic could not replicate. You are correct, he said quietly, though his voice remained taut with caution, because if the accord depends upon recognition of authority, then its foundation may be undermined by refusal, provided that refusal is both genuine and sustained. Corbin Hale, still poised and ready to strike if necessary, glanced toward Ilara with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant trust. For though the method she proposed defied every instinct honed through years of direct action, the events unfolding around them had already proven that this conflict did not obey the rules he had relied upon all his life. And if it fails, he asked, his voice low but steady. Ilara did not take her eyes from Crew. Then we will know that force was our only option, she said. But if we do not attempt this now, we may lose the chance entirely. The faintest smile touched Crew's lips, though it held none of the warmth or humanity that might once have belonged to him. You believe that refusal has power here, he said, his voice layered once more with that quiet, echoing resonance. Yet you fail to see that the system you oppose was built upon acceptance so deeply ingrained that it no longer requires conscious consent, because authority, once established, sustains itself through those who obey without question. Ilara stepped forward, her posture firm, her voice unwavering despite the immense pressure building within the chamber. Then we will question it, she said. Here, now, without hesitation. The air seemed to tighten as she spoke, the faint glow of the relics pulsing in response, while the symbols etched into the stone floor beneath them flickered briefly, as though reacting to a change in the unseen structure that governed the chamber. Vale's eyes widened slightly. It is responding, he murmured. Corbin did not lower his wand, but his stance shifted, aligning himself not merely as a combatant, but as a participant in whatever unseen exchange had begun. Elara drew in a steady breath, feeling the presence beneath the basin press closer to her thoughts, not with aggression, but with a focused and deliberate attention, as though waiting to see whether her defiance would hold. I do not recognize your authority, she said clearly, her voice carrying through the chamber with a quiet strength that seemed to resonate beyond mere sound. Not through this seal. Not through this body. Not through this place. The effect was immediate. The basin trembled. Not violently, but with a subtle disturbance that rippled across its surface, as though something beneath it had shifted position in response to her declaration, and the glow around the seal dimmed further, its steady light breaking into uneven pulses that suggested instability rather than power. Crew's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Recognition is not required from all, he said, only from enough. Elara did not falter. Then you will find that number lacking, she replied. Behind her, Vale stepped forward, his voice firm despite the tension in his features. I do not recognize your authority, he said, nor do I acknowledge any accord formed through coercion or concealment. Corbin hesitated for the briefest of moments, then spoke as well, his tone carrying the weight of conviction forged through years of service. I do not recognize it either, he said. Not here. Not ever. The chamber reacted again, more strongly this time. The symbols along the floor flared faintly, their patterns shifting in ways that suggested the structure itself was adjusting to the declarations made within it, and the relics pulsed in uneven rhythm, no longer aligned in the steady pattern they had held before, but flickering as though their roles within the sequence had been thrown into uncertainty. The presence beneath the basin surged upward once more, pressing against the barrier Vale had cast. Yet its motion lacked the steady inevitability it had carried before, replaced instead by a restless, probing movement that suggested resistance rather than completion. Crew's grip on the seal tightened, and for a moment his expression fractured again, revealing a flicker of something that might have been strain, or perhaps the faintest remnant of the man himself, struggling against the force within him. You disrupt the pattern, he said, his voice less steady than before. But disruption does not equal defeat. Elara stepped closer, her resolve sharpening. No, she said, but it creates opportunity. The pressure in the chamber intensified, pressing against her mind with renewed force, yet she held her ground, refusing to yield to the influence that sought to bend her thoughts. And as she did, she felt something shift within that pressure, not weakening, but changing, as though the presence itself had been forced to reconsider its approach. Vale's voice cut through the tension. The sequence is destabilizing, he said. If we press now, we may force a collapse. Corbin's wand lifted slightly. Then we do not hesitate. But before they could act, the chamber changed again. The basin rose higher, the dark liquid within it lifting in a slow, unnatural column that defied gravity, and within that rising mass, shapes began to form, clearer now than before, though still indistinct, like figures seen through deep water, their outlines shifting and reforming in ways that resisted clear definition. Alara felt a sharp chill run through her. "It is adapting," she said. Crew's expression steadied once more, though the flicker of strain had not entirely vanished. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "This is not adaptation. This is revelation." The column of dark liquid extended further, reaching toward the ceiling of the chamber, and as it did, the pressure within the room deepened, pressing against every surface, every thought, every fragment of will, until it felt as though the space itself might collapse under the weight of it. Vale's voice sharpened. "We are losing control of the containment." Corbin's stance shifted, ready to act. "Then we end this now." Alara's gaze moved from the rising column to Crew, then to the relics, and finally to the shifting symbols beneath their feet. And in that moment, she understood something that had not been clear before, something that altered the shape of the conflict in a single, decisive instant. "This is not the final stage," she said. Vale turned to her. "What do you mean?" Alara's voice remained steady, though urgency now threaded through it. "The accord is not meant to bring them through completely," she said. "It is meant to establish a foothold, a point of presence within our world that can expand once it is secured." Corbin frowned. "Then this is only the beginning." "Yes," Alara said, "and if we allow even that, we may not be able to stop what follows." The realization settled heavily among them, sharpening the stakes beyond anything they had yet faced, because it meant that even partial failure would carry consequences they might not be able to contain. Vale's expression hardened. "Then we must force a complete collapse, not merely disrupt the sequence." Alara nodded. "Yes," she said, "and to do that we must break not only the authority, but the connection itself." Corbin's eyes narrowed. "How?" Alara looked at the rising column, at the shifting shapes within it, and at the faint, persistent pull that still lingered at the edge of her thoughts. "By turning its own link against it," she said. Before either man could respond, she stepped forward, moving past Corbin and towards the basin, her wand held firmly at her side, her gaze fixed on the dark surface that now rose before her like a living thing. "Alara," Vale said sharply, "that is not—" But she did not stop. Because she understood now that the connection it had formed with her was not merely a danger. It was a path. And if she could follow that path far enough, she might reach the point where it could be severed. The pressure surged as she approached, the presence beneath the basin pressing against her mind with renewed intensity. Yet she did not retreat, and as she reached the edge of the rising column, she raised her head and met it directly, not with fear, but with deliberate and unwavering intent. "If you seek entry," she said softly, "then you must pass through me." The chamber fell silent, and for the first time, the presence answered. The answer did not come as a voice in the ordinary sense, nor as a phrase shaped by lips or breath, but as a vast and terrible nearness that entered Alara's mind like cold water entering a locked chamber, filling every silent place at once with the weight of something ancient, patient, and wholly certain of its own endurance. And though she neither moved nor cried out, her whole body felt the force of that contact, as though she had stepped to the edge of an abyss and found the abyss not empty, but listening. Around her the chamber remained dim and stone-bound, the basin lifted in its unnatural dark column, the relics pulsing like unsettled stars within Vale's layered spheres of containment, and Julian Crew standing rigid with the minister's seal in his hand. Yet all of that seemed to drift to the edges of perception as the presence pressed more fully against her thoughts, not seeking at first to break them, but to read them, to test their shape, and to discover the place where resistance ended and entry might begin. She felt memories stir under that pressure, not torn from her, but brushed with deliberate care, as though some unseen intelligence were turning the pages of a book whose language it had once known and wished to master again. And with that invasion came images not her own, or not wholly her own, of torchlight burning in chambers older than Hogwarts, of circles of cloaked figures gathered around pale stone basins, of promises spoken not for justice but for order, and of frightened witches and wizards yielding power to whatever first taught them that power could be made lawful if wrapped in ritual and fear. Then the image shifted. She saw a hill beneath a black sky. Though whether it stood where London now stood she could not tell, and upon that hill there rose no ministry, no atrium, no gilded lifts or ordered offices, but a ring of standing stones around a hollow cut into the earth, while men and women in robes rougher and older than any she knew knelt with wands lowered. Not in worship exactly, but in bargaining submission. And beneath them, from somewhere below the hill, there came the same patient awareness she now felt against her mind, older then and stronger, teaching them forms of binding, forms of law, forms of magical obedience that would outlive all their names. Elara understood at once that these were not history in any reliable human sense, because the presence was not showing her facts for her benefit, but impressions useful to itself, truths shaped into whatever form her mind could bear, and yet the meaning remained clear enough. The first ones, if that name could even hold such things, had not once ruled openly over the wizarding world. They had ruled through structure, through accord, through systems that turned human fear into willing channels. They had been denied, buried, fragmented, and driven down into hidden foundations. But some part of what they made had survived above them in altered form, softened by centuries, humanized by institutions, and still carrying the faint memory of the first bargain. A thought touched her then, and though it wore the shape of language, it was more like intention clothed in meaning. You live within our architecture, and call it your own. The force of that realization struck her harder than fear, because it explained too much at once. The relics, the hidden halls, the need for recognition, the way authority itself had become the chosen road back into the world. And for a perilous instant, she felt how tempting surrender might be. Not because the presence offered kindness, but because it offered order so ancient and complete that resistance seemed, beside it, small and improvised and painfully mortal. But temptation was not truth, and Elara, who had spent enough years among cursed objects, deceitful testimony, and men who mistook control for wisdom, knew well the scent of power pretending to be necessity. Within that inner pressure she answered, not aloud, but with the stubborn force of her own thought. You were denied once. You can be denied again. The presence did not rage, for rage belonged to creatures subject to hurry and wounded pride, and this thing seemed beyond both. Instead, it pressed deeper, and with that deeper pressure came another vision, closer now, sharper, and meant not to persuade but to wound. She saw the ministry above in chaos, offices sealed, lift shafts jammed, curse fire in the corridors, witches and wizards turning on one another under whispers no one else could hear, and at the center of it all a shattered atrium where the statues had cracked and toppled into the fountain basin while dark-robed figures moved calmly through the ruin, collecting seals, keys, charters, and departmental rights as though gathering inheritance. Then that image widened, and she saw Diagon Alley shuttered, Owl Post silenced, Hogwarts wards trembling as signatures and authorities from the ministry below rewrote protections above, not by force of battle, but by force of acknowledged jurisdiction. Your world breaks itself without us, came the thought, calm as winter stone. We offer continuity. Ilara held against it, though sweat had begun to bead cold along her neck and spine, because the danger now was not bodily collapse, but the wearing away of certainty, the slow and terrible erosion by which old evils made room for themselves, not through dramatic conquest, but through the patient repetition of plausible lies. Beyond the inward struggle, she became dimly aware of voices in the chamber, Vale calling her name in a tone taut with alarm, Corbin speaking an incantation sharp and controlled, and another sound beneath those, the fractured voice of Julian Crewe, still possessed, and yet straining now as though something human in him had begun to push back from great depth. Ilara, Vale said more clearly now, do not let it anchor through you. Hold only the connection, not the exchange. Hold only the connection. The words gave shape to what she needed, and in that instant she understood the difference. The presence wanted more than attention. It wanted acceptance, however small, the slightest inward yielding by which its path through her could become not mere contact, but foothold. If she resisted blindly, it might crush through force. If she yielded, it would settle. But if she held the line between those two states, open enough to feel, closed enough to deny, then perhaps the path could indeed be used both ways. She drew a long, steady breath and narrowed her focus not upon the pressure itself, but upon the trace within it, the underlying current that connected this chamber to whatever deeper locus sustained the first ones below. It was like seeking a single silver thread inside a storm-dark web, but it was there, and once she sensed it, she followed it inward. The chamber disappeared. Or rather, it ceased to matter. She found herself in a place that wasn't a place, a depth of mind and magic where structure existed without stone, where arches formed and dissolved from pale lines of force, and where far below or far within there stood something like a hall made of interlocked circles, each circle inscribed with symbols older than language, and at the center of those circles lay a dark opening ringed by the same patient intelligence she had felt since first entering the chamber beyond Chamber 9. This, she knew at once, was the true seat of the accord, not the visible basin above, but the deeper wound beneath it, the root through which every relic, every hidden hall, every whisper in the ministry had been feeding. And there, around that opening, stood forms. Not bodies, not ghosts, and not anything she could describe afterward without falsifying it, because her mind insisted on giving them outlines while every outline failed. They were presences gathered in old relation to one another, each distinct and yet not separate, and though none had faces, she felt their regard settle upon her with an ancient and practiced interest. One of them, or the central pressure among them, extended that same thought into her mind again. You came to sever. It was not a question. Ilara answered with the whole of her will. Yes. Then you must choose what closes, the door or the bearer. At once she understood the cruelty of it, because the bearer did not mean her. It meant Julian Crewe. The accord above was being completed through his authority, his seal, his office made into a living threshold, and if the link were severed at the level of the bearer, it would rip the presence free of him, but perhaps at the cost of his life or mind. If the door were closed instead, the structure might collapse more cleanly, but only if she could find the point where recognition itself had been chained into the system. A trap, then, though a subtle one, because it presented sacrifice as the only expedient certainty. She refused it. There is a third way. The gathered presences did not answer, but the pressure about the dark opening tightened, and she knew she had startled them, not because they feared her, but because the system they had shaped relied upon human minds accepting the frame of the choice offered, and she had stepped outside it. She searched the deep structure again, looking not at the opening, not at the gathered presences, not at the path through crew, but at the circles surrounding them, at the interlocked patterns of binding and recognition and permission. And there, faint but unmistakable, she sensed the flaw. The accord could not sustain itself on authority alone. It required witnesses. Not legal witnesses, not names on parchment, but minds present to recognize that the accord existed and had been validly enacted. That was why the chamber responded to spoken refusal. That was why the relics pulsed unevenly when she, Vale, and Corbin denied the authority being claimed. Their awareness was part of the mechanism. Witnesses had always been required, whether kneeling around ancient stones or standing in hidden halls beneath the ministry. And witnesses, she realized with sudden fierce clarity, could refuse not merely the ruler, but the accord itself. The path snapped back outward as she seized that truth, and the chamber returned around her in a rush of cold stone, torch shadow, strained magic, and the towering dark column above the basin. She stumbled, caught herself, and heard Corbin move sharply toward her before halting as she raised one hand. "I know how to break it," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Vale's face was pale with effort, silver light still straining from his wand into the barrier over the basin. "Say it quickly." "It needs witnesses," Ilara said. "Not just a bearer and authority. It needs minds present to recognize the accord as real. That is why our refusal mattered, and why the sequence has not stabilized. We are not merely interrupting it. We are constituting it by being here." Corbin frowned. "Then leaving would stop it?" "No," Vale said at once, understanding before she finished. "Because crew is here, and the presence itself counts as the other side of the accord. It only needs sufficient recognition to complete." Ilara nodded. "Which means we do not merely refuse authority. We deny the accord's validity in full, together, and we direct that denial not at crew, but at the structure itself." Crew lifted his head then, and though the possession still held him, there was strain now in every line of his body, as though the battle within had begun to cost both occupant and host. "You cannot unmake what was first made in fear," he said, though the resonance in his voice trembled faintly around the edges. "You are children in a house whose foundations remember their master." Ilara turned fully toward him, and toward the basin, and toward the invisible hall below, while Vale moved to her left, and Corbin to her right, 3 living minds standing as witnesses, where once there had perhaps been circles of kneeling assent. "Then let the foundations remember this as well," she said. Vale's voice joined hers, low and formal without becoming grand, as though instinct rather than rehearsal gave shape to the words. "We deny this accord." Corbin spoke next, his tone hard as drawn steel. "We deny its authority, its claim, and its rite of passage." Ilara felt the pressure gather, pushing back, trying to force uncertainty into the space of declaration. Yet she went on. "We do not witness consent. We witness coercion. We do not witness law. We witness trespass. We do not witness inheritance. We witness theft." The chamber shuddered. The symbols on the floor flared bright, then broke into fractured lines of light that no longer aligned with the basin. The relics at Vale's side pulsed violently, each out of rhythm with the others. The minister's seal in Cru's hand blazed once with painful brilliance, then dimmed, and in that same instant Julian Cru cried out, not with the layered resonance of the thing within him, but in his own voice, raw and human and full of pain. The dark column convulsed. Something beneath the basin had understood at last that the path was not merely blocked. It was being judged invalid. And somewhere below the ministry, in the hidden seat of the first accord, ancient structures began to crack. The fracture did not begin with sound alone, but with a sensation that ran through stone, air, and thought alike, as though something woven into the very fabric of the chamber had been pulled taut beyond its endurance, and now began, thread by thread, to give way under a pressure older than the ministry, and more deliberate than any spell cast within it. And as the light beneath their feet shattered into jagged lines that no longer formed a pattern, Elara felt the presence recoil, not in panic, but in a cold and precise recognition that the structure it had relied upon was no longer stable. Julian Cru staggered backward, the seal slipping from his grasp and striking the stone floor with a sound that rang unnaturally loud in the collapsing silence. And though his body remained upright, it trembled now with visible strain, as though two opposing forces had laid claim to him at once, and neither had yet secured victory. Vale's wand burned with silver fire as he struggled to maintain what remained of the containment barrier above the basin, yet even as he did so, he knew it would not hold, because the nature of the disturbance had changed, shifting from a rising force seeking entry to a destabilizing collapse that threatened to tear apart the very threshold through which that force had tried to pass. "It is breaking," he said, his voice strained but controlled. "The accord is failing." Corbin stepped forward, his attention fixed on Cru, though his wand remained ready for whatever might follow. "Then we finish it." Elara did not move at once, because she felt something deeper within the collapse, something that did not align with simple defeat, but rather with a withdrawal that carried intention. And though the structure around them was failing, the presence itself remained, pulling back from the fractured connection with a calm that suggested not loss, but patience. "It is not ending," she said quietly. "It is retreating." The basin shuddered violently, the dark liquid collapsing inward upon itself as though drawn back into a depth that no longer aligned with the surface. And within that receding motion, the shapes that had begun to form dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only a void-like stillness that seemed less like emptiness and more like the absence of something that had been there only moments before. Vale's barrier faltered, then vanished entirely, its purpose rendered meaningless by the sudden withdrawal of the force it had been meant to contain. And in the silence that followed, the chamber seemed larger, emptier, and yet no less unsettling, as though the danger had not been removed, but merely displaced beyond immediate reach. Cru collapsed to his knees. The sound of his breath, ragged and uneven, filled the chamber in place of the vanished pressure, and for a moment no one moved toward him, because the uncertainty of what remained within him still lingered, a shadow that could not be dismissed without caution. Corbin approached first, his wand steady, his expression unreadable. "Minister," he said, his voice firm. "Can you hear me?" Cru did not answer immediately. His head remained bowed, his hands braced against the stone as though he struggled to hold himself upright. And when at last he lifted his gaze, there was something in his eyes that had not been present before, something fragile, human, and painfully aware. "I hear you," he said hoarsely. Relief did not come at once, because even restored voices could carry echoes of what had once controlled them. Yet Alara felt the difference immediately, not as a certainty, but as an absence of that cold, layered presence that had spoken through him before. Vale stepped closer, lowering his wand slightly, though he did not dismiss it entirely. "Do you know where you are?" he asked. Crew swallowed, his breath still uneven. "Yes," he said, "below the Department of Mysteries." His gaze shifted to the basin, now still and empty. "It was here," he added quietly. "I felt it." Alara stepped forward then, her voice calm but careful. "What do you remember?" Crew closed his eyes briefly, as though sorting through fragments that did not wish to settle into order. "I remember voices," he said. "Not words, not at first. Just presence, watching, waiting. Then it began to speak in a way I could understand, not aloud, but within thought." His expression tightened. "It told me the ministry was failing. That order would collapse. That what we call authority is already broken. Only we refuse to see it. It offered..." He hesitated. "Offered what?" Corbin pressed. "A way to restore it," Crew said. "Not through force, but through alignment, through recognition of something older, something that came before our laws and could shape them again into something stronger." Vale's expression darkened slightly. "Consent misnamed." Crew nodded faintly. "Yes," he said, though it did not call it that. It spoke of continuity, of inheritance, of restoring what had been lost when the first structures were broken and buried. Alara watched him closely. "And you believed it?" Crew did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. "For a moment," he said, "because it did not feel like coercion. It felt like inevitability." The word settled heavily among them. "I thought," he continued, "that if I could use the seal, if I could formalize what it offered, then the chaos we have seen in recent years might end, and the ministry might become something unshakable again." Corbin let out a quiet breath. "And instead, you nearly handed it the keys." Crew flinched slightly, though he did not deny it. "Yes," he said. Silence followed. Not long, but long enough to allow the weight of what had nearly happened to settle fully into their understanding. Vale spoke next. "The accord has been broken," he said, "but not destroyed, because what we disrupted was the formation of a foothold, not the existence of the presence itself. And unless we sever the connection entirely, it may attempt again, perhaps through another bearer, another sequence, another moment of weakness." Alara nodded slowly. "It will not stop," she said, "because it does not need to win quickly. It only needs to succeed once." Corbin looked at the relics, which now hovered in still, dim containment fields, their earlier pulsing reduced to a faint and irregular flicker. "Then we remove its tools," he said. "Destroy the relics." Vale shook his head. "No," he said. "Not yet. If they are anchors, destroying them without understanding their deeper function may release whatever remains bound to them, or shift its connection elsewhere, beyond our reach." Crew lifted his head, his strength returning slowly. "Then what do we do?" he asked. Alara looked at the basin, at the empty surface that no longer held movement, yet still seemed to conceal something beneath it, and then she looked beyond it, as though seeing not the chamber itself, but the deeper structure it concealed. "We go further," she said. Vale's eyes narrowed. "Further?" "To the root," Alara replied. "To the place I saw when the connection deepened. the hall beneath this chamber, where the accord is truly anchored. Corbin frowned. And you believe we can reach it? Elara met his gaze. Yes, she said, because the path still exists, even if the accord has been broken, and if we do not take it now, while the connection is weakened, we may never have another chance. Vale considered this carefully, his expression grave. If we go deeper, he said, we may not be able to return. Elara did not hesitate. If we do not go, she said, this will happen again. The simplicity of that truth left little room for argument. Corbin exhaled slowly, then nodded. Then we finish it, he said. Crew struggled to his feet, though his movements remained unsteady. You will need the seal, he said, his voice firm despite the lingering strain. If there is any structure left that recognizes authority, it may still respond to it. Vale hesitated. That carries risk, he said. Crew met his gaze. So does leaving it behind, he replied. Elara stepped forward, picking up the seal from where it had fallen, its surface now dim and cold, no longer glowing with unnatural light, yet still carrying the weight of its office. Then we take it, she said. The decision settled among them like a drawn line that could not be crossed back, and as Vale gathered the relics once more into their containment spheres, and Corbin adjusted his grip on his wand, and Crew steadied himself beside them, the chamber seemed to shift subtly, as though acknowledging their intent. The basin remained still. The pressure was gone. But the path remained. And somewhere below, beyond the broken accord and the fractured threshold, the deeper structure waited. Not silent, not defeated, but patient. And as they prepared to descend further into that hidden depth, Elara felt the faintest echo of that presence once more, not pressing, not reaching, but observing from afar, as though aware that the confrontation was not yet over, and that what came next would determine not merely the fate of the ministry, but the future of the balance between those who ruled by will and those who ruled by consent. And this time, there would be no hidden accord to shape the outcome. The descent beyond the broken chamber did not unfold through any visible passage, but through a subtle unraveling of the space itself, as though the boundary between surface and depth had been weakened by the collapse of the accord, allowing those who carried its mark to pass where no corridor had ever been built. And as Elara Vance stepped forward with the minister's seal held firmly in her hand, she felt the world around her shift, not violently, but with the quiet inevitability of a threshold being acknowledged. The stone beneath her feet dissolved into something less certain, not vanishing, but thinning into a suggestion of ground rather than a solid foundation, while the air grew still and heavy, as though it no longer belonged entirely to the world above. And when she glanced back, she saw that the chamber they had left behind had already faded into a dim and distant impression, as though it had never been more than a surface layer over something far deeper. Corbin Hale remained close at her side, his wand held ready, though its light seemed strangely muted in this place, as if ordinary magic struggled to assert itself fully within a structure that had been shaped long before modern spellcraft had taken form. And though his expression remained steady, there was a tension in his stance that spoke of instincts sharpened to their limit, prepared for a threat that might not reveal itself in any familiar way. Septimus Vale followed just behind, the relics still suspended within their containment fields, though their light had dimmed to a faint and uncertain glow, as though they no longer functioned as independent objects, but had become reflections of a deeper system whose coherence had been disrupted, and yet not entirely undone. Julian Crew moved with care, his strength returning slowly. Though the weight of what he had endured still lingered in his movements, and the seal, now in Ilara's possession, seemed to have lost its oppressive aura, reduced once more to a symbol of office rather than a conduit of something far older and more dangerous. They emerged into a vast and silent expanse that defied simple description, for it was neither cavern nor hall, but something that held aspects of both while fully conforming to neither, its boundaries defined not by walls, but by shifting planes of dim, silvery light that intersected and curved in patterns too precise to be natural and too fluid to be entirely fixed. At the center of this space stood the structure Ilara had glimpsed before, now clearer, though no less unsettling. It was a series of concentric circles, each formed of faintly glowing lines that hovered just above the ground. Inscribed with symbols that carried the same ancient pattern she had seen in the upper chambers. Yet here they were intact, their meaning still active, still connected to whatever force had once shaped them into being. Within the innermost circle lay a dark opening, not a hole in the ground, but a void-like absence that seemed to consume light rather than reflect it. And around that opening the presence gathered, not in visible form, but in a pressure so dense and deliberate that it shaped the air itself, creating the unmistakable sense of something watching, something waiting, and something that had not been fully denied. Ilara stopped at the edge of the outermost circle, her breath steady despite the weight pressing against her thoughts. "This is it," she said quietly. Vale stepped beside her, his gaze fixed on the central void. "The origin of the accord," he said. "Or at least the deepest remaining fragment of it." Corbin's eyes moved across the structure, taking in its form, its patterns, its unsettling stillness. "And whatever remains of them," he added. Crew said nothing, though his expression had grown more severe, as though he felt the pull of the place even now, not as strongly as before, but enough to remind him how easily he had been drawn into its influence. The presence stirred. Not suddenly, not violently, but with a slow and deliberate shift that made the air seem heavier, as though attention itself had weight, and that weight had turned fully upon them. Ilara felt it at once, that same ancient awareness brushing against her mind, though now it carried no attempt at persuasion, no illusion of benevolence, but only a clear and unmistakable recognition of opposition. A thought formed, not spoken, but present. "You return." Ilara did not flinch. "We came to end this," she said. The presence did not answer immediately, and in that silence there was no uncertainty, but rather the calm of something that had already considered every possible outcome, and found them all within its patience. Then the pressure deepened, and with it came the faintest impression of something vast, shifting beyond the void, as though the true extent of the presence lay far beyond what they could perceive, connected to this point only through the remnants of a structure long since broken. "You cannot end what is not bounded," the thought came, steady and unyielding. "You can only refuse what is offered." Vale spoke then, his voice carrying both caution and resolve. "We refuse it again," he said, "here, at its source." The presence did not resist the statement, nor did it acknowledge it in any direct way, yet the pressure shifted slightly, as though the refusal had been noted, placed within a framework of understanding that extended beyond human concepts of victory or defeat. Corbin stepped forward, his wand raised. "Then we do more than refuse," he said. "We dismantle whatever remains of this." Ilara shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "Not by force, not here." Vale glanced at her. "Then how?" Elara looked at the circles, at the symbols, at the void, and at the faint, persistent connection that still lingered between them and the presence beyond. "This place exists because it was once recognized," she said, "not just by those who built it, but by those who accepted it." Crew's voice was quiet. "Then we remove that recognition entirely." Elara nodded. "Yes," she said. "Not just refusal, but rejection of the structure itself, of the idea that this place holds any authority at all." Vale's expression sharpened. "A dissolution of meaning," he said, "not destruction of form." Corbin frowned slightly. "You are telling us to unmake it by denying what it is." "Yes," Elara said, "because it only exists as a system if it is understood as one." The presence shifted again, and for the first time there was something like resistance within it. Not fear, but a tightening, as though the path they had chosen had not been the one it expected. "You cannot unlearn what has been built into you," the thought came, deeper now, more insistent. Elara stepped forward, crossing the outer circle, her movement deliberate and unwavering. "Then we begin," she said. Vale and Corbin followed, though the strain in the air deepened as they moved inward, the circles beneath their feet flickering faintly, as though reacting to their presence not as participants, but as disruptions. Crew hesitated only briefly before stepping after them, his gaze fixed on the void. Together, they stood within the structure. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, not in surrender, but in focus, drawing her thoughts inward. Stripping away the layers of meaning that had been imposed upon the place, the assumptions, the inherited understanding of authority, of structure, of order. "This is not a hall," she said quietly. "It is not a place of power. It is not a seat of authority." Vale's voice joined hers. "It is not law. It is not binding. It is not recognized." Corbin followed, his tone firm. "It is not ours to obey. It is not ours to uphold." Crew spoke last, his voice steady despite the lingering echo of what had once held him. "It is not real," he said. The circles flickered. The symbols dimmed. The void shifted. The presence pressed harder, its pressure now undeniable, yet still controlled, still restrained within the boundaries of something it could not fully override. "You speak denial, but you stand within it." The thought came, stronger now. Elara opened her eyes. "Yes," she said, "and we will leave it empty." The light beneath their feet fractured, the circles breaking into uneven lines that no longer aligned, no longer formed a pattern, no longer held meaning, and the void at the center wavered, its edges destabilizing as though the absence it represented could no longer sustain itself without recognition. Vale's voice sharpened. "It is collapsing." Corbin raised his wand, ready for whatever might follow. "Then we finish it." Elara stepped forward one last time, toward the center, toward the void, toward the final point of connection. "This ends here," she said. And as the structure around them began to unravel, the presence withdrew once more, not in defeat, but in a final, silent acknowledgement that this attempt had failed. For now, and with that, the first accord broke. When the first accord broke, it did not do so with the violence of an explosion or the ruinous thunder of collapsing stone, but with a long and dreadful unmaking that passed through the hidden depth beneath the ministry, like a forgotten name being stripped from every wall on which it had once been carved. And as the concentric circles of light fractured around Elara Vance, and the central void began to fold inward upon itself, she felt the ancient pressure withdraw, not in panic, nor even in anger, but with the cold composure of something that had lost a game it fully intended to play again. The space around them shuddered as meaning left it, and that was the strangest part of all, for the hall did not merely crumble, but ceased to hold the shape it had possessed a moment before, as though each line, each symbol, each hidden law that had sustained it was being peeled away from the world, until what remained was no longer a place of passage or accord, but only a hollow beneath the earth, stripped of the power it had once claimed. "Move," Septimus Vale said, and though he did not shout, the urgency in his voice cut clearly through the failing silence. Corbin Hale seized Julian Crew by the arm before the acting minister could lose his footing, while Ilara stepped back from the center just as the void narrowed into a dark seam no wider than a wand's breadth, and then narrower still, until it resembled a crack in glass through which no light could pass. The relics responded at once. The stone disc split cleanly across its spiral mark and fell silent within its sphere of containment. The blackened chain sagged as though whatever strain had once held it taut had vanished. The tarnished goblet dulled to ordinary metal. The pale shard flashed once with a faint silver gleam and then went dark, and the ring that had carried the weight of permission gave a dry, brittle snap, dividing at last into two lifeless halves. Vale stared at them only briefly, and there was something like weary satisfaction in his face. "They are empty," he said. "Then let us not remain to mourn them," Corbin replied, pulling Crew farther back as the ground beneath their feet trembled with a slow, rolling force that suggested the deeper structure was settling into collapse. The way out did not reveal itself at once, which would have been almost laughable had the danger been less immediate, and for one taut instant the four of them stood amidst dimming light and disintegrating symbols with no visible path before them, until the minister's seal in Ilara's hand grew warm, then warmer still, and a thin line of gold spread outward along the floor, not toward the vanished center, but back the way they had come. "The seal remembers the upper structure," Vale said quickly. "Follow it." They did. The golden line brightened with each step, winding through darkness that no longer felt inhabited, though not entirely harmless, because the hidden places below the ministry had been shaped by old magic for too many centuries to become innocent in a single night. And once, as they passed through a narrowing span of shifting stone, Ilara thought she heard a whisper at the edge of hearing. Not a threat, not a command, but only the fading trace of something ancient drawing farther away into depths beyond their reach. No one spoke of it. By the time they emerged once more into the chamber of the basin, the dark liquid had vanished entirely, leaving behind only dry, pale stone, cracked down the middle like a vessel that had failed in its purpose. And from there, the return through the hidden passages felt swifter, as though the ministry itself, relieved of a pressure long buried beneath its heart, had ceased resisting their ascent. When at last they entered the upper corridors below the Department of Mysteries, they found Madame Stroud waiting with a ring of trusted witches and wizards at her back, every wand raised until she saw their faces clearly and lowered her own. For the space of one breath, no one moved. Then her eyes went at once to Crew, then to the relic cases, then to Ilara. "Well," she said, in a voice made intentionally level by long practice, "either you succeeded, or I have lost the ability to judge disaster on sight." "We succeeded," said Corbin, before any of the others could answer, though his tone held none of triumph, and only a grim finality. "But seal every lower chamber regardless." Madame Stroud gave a sharp nod, already turning to issue orders, and the agents behind her moved at once because some victories required immediate caution more than celebration. The hours that followed passed in a blur of containment wards, testimony, healers' checks, and sealed briefings in rooms where no parchment was permitted to copy itself and no portrait was allowed to listen. And by dawn, the first practical signs of change had begun to show themselves throughout the ministry. The whispered episodes ceased. Those who had lost time remembered no more missing moments. The oppressive heaviness that had settled in certain offices lifted like bad weather. No new relics appeared in walls, floors, or forgotten archives. And although the deepest chambers beneath the Department of Mysteries were declared permanently restricted by emergency decree, even the unspeakables could not deny that something fundamental had changed below, for the old readings, the disturbances, the subtle anomalies that had lingered for decades in sealed reports and unresolved notes had fallen suddenly and unmistakably silent. Julian Crewe resigned within the week. He did so privately, without speech-making and without plea, citing compromised judgment under hostile magical influence, which was as much truth as any formal document could bear. And though many within the ministry expected scandal, Madame Stroud saw that the matter was handled with unusual restraint, because public panic served no one, and because there were certain truths the wizarding world was not yet ready to hear. Septimus Vale returned to the Department of Mysteries, where he oversaw the sealing of all remaining lower records connected to the hidden structure, though before he vanished again into that secretive world. He met Elara once in a quiet corridor outside Level 2 and handed her a single folded scrap of old parchment. "What is it?" she asked. "A copy," he said, "of the only line from the oldest fragment that I now believe was ever properly understood." She unfolded it after he had gone, and in faded script she read, "The first rain ends where witness fails." Elara kept the scrap, though she did not speak of it. As for Corbin Hale, he said very little in the days that followed, yet something in him had altered, not softened exactly, but steadied, as though the old habit of distrust had at last found a shape worthy of itself. And once, while they stood in the atrium watching ministry workers repair a cracked stretch of fountain stone, he glanced at her and said, with that dry restraint she had come to know as near praise from him, "You were right to refuse the frame of the choice." Elara looked at the bright water, at the owls crossing the enchanted ceiling above, at the clerks and aurors and messengers moving through the ordinary business of the day, and she thought how near all of it had come to being inherited by something that understood law only as a mask worn by power. "It was never their ministry," she said quietly. "No," Corbin replied, "and now it is less theirs than it was." Spring came slowly to London after that. Rain washed the soot from the upper streets, and sunlight found its way through the high windows of the ministry with increasing confidence, while below, in the sealed and forgotten dark, the broken remnants of the first accord lay empty and unrecognized. Yet Elara never wholly forgot the final sensation she had felt as the hidden hall collapsed. That cold and patient withdrawal moving farther down than thought could follow, not destroyed, not forgiven, but denied. And she understood, as perhaps only witnesses ever truly could, that some evils were not ended by fire or conquest, but by refusing to call them rightful when they returned wearing the face of order. And so the ministry endured, not because it had been flawless, nor because its foundations were pure, but because, when the old claim rose again from the dark beneath it, there had been those willing to stand in its path and say, with clear minds and unyielding hearts, that no ancient power, however patient, could rule where consent was no longer given, and in that refusal, the reign of the first ones came to nothing.
Ну що ж, друзі, з вами автор. Найбільше в цій історії мене зачепив момент, коли Елара зрозуміла, що силу давньої темряви неможливо перемогти лише чарами чи владою. Її потрібно було позбавити визнання. І тут ховається дуже цікавий парадокс. Ми часто думаємо, що небезпечні речі стають сильними через власну могутність. Але насправді багато з них стають сильними, тому що ми самі даємо їм місце у своїй свідомості. Страх, чужий вплив, токсичні люди, старі образи, вони рідко входять у наше життя силою. Часто ми непомітно визнаємо їхню владу над собою. Саме тому момент, коли Елара сказала «Я не визнаю твоєї влади», здається мені таким важливим, бо інколи найсильніший вчинок не боротися ще завзятіше, а перестати підкорятися тому, що не має права керувати твоїм життям. У цьому й полягає парадокс. Свободу ми знаходимо не тоді, коли отримуємо більше сили, а тоді, коли перестаємо віддавати її тим, хто на неї заслуговує. Іноді одне тверде «ні» здатне зачинити двері, які роками залишилися відкритими. Всім дякую за увагу. Якщо ви хочете, щоб я надалі писав для вас такі історії і маєте ідеї на них, можете залишати в коменти. Я постараюся зробити те, що ви просите, постараюся зробити це круто. Тому до нових зустрічей.